All right, let's talk about the FDA and its role in keeping our food safe. You've probably heard of the FDA, but what do they actually do when it comes to food? Think of the FDA as the watchdog for what ends up on your plate. They're responsible for ensuring that the food we buy at the grocery store or eat at a restaurant is safe to consume. They do this by setting standards and regulations that food companies have to follow, from how food is processed and packaged to what can and can't be added to it, like certain preservatives or colorings. One of their biggest tasks is inspecting food facilities, whether that's a factory producing canned goods or a place where your favorite snack is made. They make sure the conditions are sanitary and that the food isn't contaminated. If they find something unsafe, like a batch of lettuce with E. coli, they'll recall it before it causes a major outbreak. They also monitor the labels on food products, so when you're checking a box for its ingredients or nutritional facts, you can thank the FDA for requiring that information. They want you to know exactly what you're eating, especially when it comes to allergens or potential health risks. In short, the FDA is there to protect us from unsafe food and misleading claims, keeping what we eat as safe and informed as possible. But like anything, they're not perfect, and there's always room for improvement in how they enforce these rules and regulations. Dr. Rhonda Patrick recently has reported on how truly unsafe our food landscape has become, especially when it comes to processed food.
Well, for one reason, there's been a couple of new studies that have been really well done, and it's been clear that there's additives in processed foods, aside from the sugar, that seem to be detrimental to human health. And so James submitted a question, and James says, what substances in processed foods are the most detrimental to our health? Food colorings, preservatives, sweeteners, binders, anything that keeps stuff from separating. I am unclear on what are the bigger concerns and what qualifies food as processed. So there's more than 10,000 chemicals that are allowed in food sold in the U.S. 10,000, that's a lot. It's kind of eye-opening to keep that in the back of your mind when you go, we allow 10,000 chemicals to be added to our food sold here in the United States. Like, how are you going to keep track of 10,000 chemicals? That's a lot.
Today we are going to talk about food additives and where the FDA is failing us. We will answer the question, is processed food sold in the United States really safe for us to eat? I think you will find the answer very concerning, but it's not completely without hope. Armed with a better understanding of our food supports our ability to make more informed decisions. Let's break this down into an easy-to-follow way. When we talk about additives in our food, there are two types, direct and indirect. Direct additives are things that are intentionally added, like preservatives or colorings. But then there are indirect additives, like heavy metals. These aren't added on purpose, but they can end up in our food during processing, storage, or packaging. For example, if you're buying a bar of dark chocolate, it might have high levels of cadmium or arsenic. Now, these heavy metals weren't added to the chocolate, but they got there because cocoa plants naturally absorb these metals from the soil where they're grown. And when the cocoa is processed, these metals can get concentrated. So, in this case, the contamination is indirect, but it still makes its way into the food we eat. Here's something that's kind of surprising. Since the year 2000, almost 99% of food chemicals that have been introduced were approved by the food and chemical companies themselves, not directly by the FDA. This is because of a legal loophole that allows companies to declare these substances generally recognized as safe, GRAS, without the FDA thoroughly reviewing them. What this means is that most of the new food chemicals we see today weren't necessarily given a thorough safety check by the FDA. Instead, food and chemical companies decided they were safe enough to use. It's eye-opening to think about because after 2000, a huge percentage of what ends up in our food has bypassed the FDA's traditional review process. This is where we see things like nitrates, which naturally occur in plants, but then there are nitrites, which are preservatives used in cured meats. The problem with nitrites is that they can form nitrosamines, which are linked to a bunch of cancers like colon, stomach, and esophageal cancer, and possibly even thyroid and brain cancers. Now we will cover a whole list of other additives and why we should show pause for concern. Stay with me. One to watch out for is potassium bromate. This is a known carcinogen that gets added to flour, and you'll find it in packaged baked goods. Then there's propylparaben, a preservative used in pastries and sometimes tortillas, which has been shown to cause developmental and reproductive harm. Not great, right? There's also butylated hydroxyanisole, or BHA. It's another preservative that pops up in cured meats and some other foods, and it's been identified as a carcinogen. It's important to realize that a lot of the data linking meat consumption to cancer is actually based on processed meats, which are very different from eating fresh whole cuts of meat. So when you hear those stats, processed meats are a big part of the problem. Now, when we talk about foods for kids like Pop-Tarts, there's something called TBHQ in them, which harms the immune system. There's also titanium dioxide, a color additive mostly found in candy, which can damage DNA. So it's classified as a mutagen, meaning it can cause changes in your genetic material. Then there's brominated vegetable oil, or BVO, used to stabilize citrus flavors in sodas and fruity drinks, and that's been linked to neurological damage. Finally, we have the forever chemicals, or PFAS, which are toxic chemicals that hang around in our bodies and the environment for a long time. They're often found in food packaging and other products, and they're definitely not something you want in your system. They're not usually in the food itself, but they're in the packaging. So imagine you grab something pre-packaged because you're in a hurry. It looks healthy enough, right? But the packaging could have PFAS in it, and these chemicals can leach into the food, especially if it's something like soup or anything heated. The heat makes the leaching even worse, almost like it multiplies how much of these chemicals end up in the food. Now, PFAS are linked to all kinds of health risks, like an increased chance of cancer, immune system damage, and more recently, studies are pointing to reproductive harm. There's research suggesting these chemicals can lower sperm counts and affect fertility, which is pretty concerning. It's still emerging science, but the links to reproductive issues seem to be growing. Then you've got artificial colours, things like red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue 1. These are common in processed foods, especially candies, pastries and cereals aimed at kids. Studies, including some pretty solid randomized trials, have shown that these artificial colours can lead to behavioural problems in children. Kids with ADH in particular are super sensitive to them, and it can make their symptoms way worse. Next, there's the issue of artificial sweeteners. Sucrose is one of them, and these sweeteners are linked to hormone disruption and negative effects on metabolism. And here's some breaking news. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, recently classified aspartame, another popular sweetener, as possibly carcinogenic to humans. That's a big deal. It happened just in the last month or so. You'll find aspartame in a lot of diet drinks, so it's something that's definitely raising eyebrows. So when it comes to heavy metals, a lot of them can leach into food as indirect contaminants. They can even show up in baby food, which can slow down growth and development. That's one category of processed foods, the chemicals. But there's also another big category, which is ultra-processed foods. There was a study published in 2021, Kevin Hall's study, that looked at these ultra-processed foods. They're basically foods that are industrially manufactured, ready to eat, or ready to heat. Think of them as snacky foods, or what most people just call junk food. This includes things like flavored yogurts, breakfast cereals, and other foods that are often labeled as being enriched with nutrients. But even though they might seem healthier, they're still considered ultra-processed. There's been a lot of research showing that ultra-processed foods are harmful. They contribute to metabolic issues, weight gain, and they've been linked to cardiovascular disease. When we talk about too much refined sugar or saturated fat, ultra-processed foods are doing a lot of the same damage. On top of that, they tend to have high calorie counts and are packed with refined sugars and unhealthy fats, which just makes them even more dangerous. Trans fats, for example, have been banned now, but they were in our foods for a long time, and they really messed with our cholesterol levels and increased the risk of heart disease. Then there are also inorganic phosphate salts, which get absorbed more easily than the naturally occurring phosphorus in foods. Research shows that having too much dietary phosphorus can lead to cardiovascular problems and mess with your hormones. Speaking of hormones, BPA is another chemical that affects the endocrine system. You'll see a lot of packaging materials that say BPA-free now, but many of those have just swapped BPA for BPS, which is also linked to hormone disruption. So it's like you're trading one harmful chemical for another. Honestly, it's probably better to avoid plastic altogether, like using a stainless steel water bottle instead. BPA has been shown to mimic estrogen in the body, which can lead to insulin resistance, inflammation, and even issues with how your pancreas functions. There's plenty of preclinical research backing this up, plus observational data that points to BPA's negative effects. Then there are other compounds formed when food is heated at high temperatures, like acrylamide. It can show up when you cook foods really hot, and it's also found in certain food additives used in ultra-processed foods. Most people don't realize that all these things are lurking in processed foods they eat daily. The real issue is when people are eating large amounts of processed foods day in and day out. Sure, having it occasionally when you're traveling or in a pinch isn't going to hurt, but eating this stuff all the time can have serious long-term effects on your health. It messes with your endocrine system, brain function, DNA, metabolism, and can contribute to heart disease and obesity. It's affecting multiple systems in your body. At the end of the day, it comes back to the idea of a whole foods diet. Forget all the fad diets like paleo, keto, or carnivore. If you stick to eating real, whole foods, like fruits, vegetables, meats, poultry, fish, and nuts, you're going to be healthier. You don't need to follow a specific diet. Just focus on real food, and you'll be doing your body a huge favor. We covered a lot of food chemicals in this video, so please feel free to leave a comment, or if you have a question. Until then, take a mental inventory of how often you might be eating processed, ultra-processed foods, and really consider lowering how often you consume these items. Until next time, stay well.